Thank you for gathering the Mandalorians into one place. Mandalore will live on in me. Forged from Beskar alloy, I will create an army that will bring order to the galaxy. Activate the interceptors and bombers. Bo-Katan. Surrender the Darksaber and tell these people that this planet is mine.
Fall back! I'll cover the rear! This is the way.
Once a proud and fearsome warrior culture, the Mandalorians have long been reduced to fragmented tribes, divided by ideology, war, and betrayal. For years, the dream of returning to Mandalore, their shattered homeworld, had remained just that, a dream. Poisoned skies, myths of radiation, and the devastating purge executed by the Empire had rendered the surface a haunted memory. But as Season 3 of The Mandalorian unfolds, that myth begins to unravel. At the heart of this story is Bo-Katan Kryze, a former princess and once hopeful ruler, now a lone survivor watching her people scatter. Alongside her stands Din Djarin, the resolute bounty hunter and devout follower of the Way, whose recent pilgrimage into the living waters of Mandalore symbolized not only personal redemption, but the possibility that the planet might not be dead after all. By Chapter 23, titled The Spies, both Bo-Katan and Din stand on the cusp of something greater than either of them imagined the chance to unite all Mandalorians, regardless of creed, and reclaim their home. The seeds of unity are not planted easily. In earlier seasons, Bo-Katan had viewed Din Djarin as an obstacle, an adherent of an archaic code that had splintered her people. She considered the Children of the Watch as extremists, relics of an outdated era. Conversely, Din saw her and her faction as unfaithful to the Way. But war and survival have a way of erasing differences. Over the course of Season 3, Din proves his loyalty to Bo-Katan not through words, but through action. He repeatedly fights by her side and trusts her with the protection of Grogu, and most importantly, yields the symbol of leadership, the Darksaber. Though initially reluctant, Bo-Katan eventually accepts the blade not out of hunger for power, but out of necessity. The Mandalorians need a leader, and she is finally ready to become one. The turning point comes when the Armorer, the spiritual leader of the Children of the Watch, endorses Bo-Katan. She declares the bow walks both ways, honoring the ancient creed while embracing a broader future. This moment is significant. It is a quiet revolution. A woman once exiled from her own throne is now entrusted to unite all Mandalorians. Once sanctioned by the Armorer, Bo-Katan sets out to gather the remaining Mandalorians. Among them are her own former followers, mercenaries who had long since given up on the hope of Mandalore's revival. But she returns with a vision, and with the Darksaber. One by one, they follow her. Din Djarin, ever loyal, pledges his allegiance not to the blade, but to Bo-Katan herself. "Your song is not yet written," he tells her. "I will serve you until it is." In this act, Din not only submits his own authority, but offers a bridge between the once fractured clans. Together, these factions form a coalition, traveling back to Mandalore for the first time in years. Their mission is simply establish a base and begin the first steps of reclaiming the planet. But Mandalore is not as abandoned as they thought. Unknown to the Mandalorians, deep beneath the crust of Mandalore lies a secret. Moff Gideon has returned, and he has made the ruined planet his stronghold. Having escaped custody, Gideon has been operating in the shadows. He has allied himself with remnants of the Imperial Shadow Council, who now believe the time is ripe to reassert control across the galaxy. Gideon's plan is sinister yet methodical: build a new generation of soldiers using Beskar, the sacred Mandalorian metal, and integrate them with his own twisted experiments combining clone technology, Mandalorian combat training, and Jedi power. The Mandalorians, unaware of the looming threat, descend deeper into Mandalore to search for survivors and resources. They are led by a team of scouts, some loyal to Bo-Katan, others hailing from Din's tribe. Together, they navigate ancient ruins and treacherous terrain until they encounter a battered group of Mandalorian survivors who never left the planet. These survivors warn them that something stirs in the shadows and that they are not alone. and then the trap is sprung. As the Mandalorians explore deeper, they find themselves in a cavernous forge, once the site of sacred Mandalorian craftsmanship. Suddenly, armored troopers descend, but these are no ordinary stormtroopers. Clad in Beskar armor and armed with high-powered weaponry, they fight with an efficiency and brutality the Mandalorians have not encountered before. The battle is fierce. Despite being caught off guard, Bo-Katan's leadership and Din Djarin's precision keep the team moving, but the enemy is coordinated. They push the Mandalorians toward a sealed blast door, and behind the door stands Moff Gideon, appearing in a menacing suit of black Beskar armor with horns that echo Darth Maul's Mandalorian loyalists. Gideon reveals his hand. He has been using Mandalore as a base to create the next evolution of Dark Troopers, ones infused with Mandalorian combat prowess and even elements of the Force. He mocks Bo-Katan, claiming that Mandalorians are weak because of their loyalty to tradition. He captures Din Djarin, isolating him from the others, and orders his troops to kill the rest. But before they can advance, one man steps forward to buy them time. Paz Vizsla, a warrior from the Tribe of the Watch, a man whose lineage dates back to Tara Vizsla, the first Mandalorian Jedi, makes his final stand. As the others retreat through the blast door, Paz remains behind, wielding his massive heavy repeater. With unrelenting fury, he cuts down trooper after trooper. The weapon overheats, but he doesn't falter. He switches to brute force, using his fists, his armor, anything he can. And then they come, the elite Praetorian Guards. Clad in crimson armor and wielding electro weapons, these guards are among the deadliest fighters in the Imperial arsenal. They engage Paz in a swift and brutal duel. Despite his strength, he is overwhelmed. In a heartbreaking moment, he is pierced multiple times and falls to the ground lifeless. His sacrifice is not in vain. He buys the Mandalorians enough time to escape and regroup. But his death sends a chilling message. Gideon is stronger than ever, and the fight to reclaim Mandalore has only just begun. Paz Vizsla's death is more than just the loss of a warrior. It is the death of a lineage, a legacy. The Vizslas once ruled Mandalore, and now one of their last scions dies defending it. It is a brutal reminder that Mandalorian unity comes with a cost. Bo-Katan, once hesitant to embrace her role, now finds herself at the center of a war for identity. She sees firsthand the horrors that Gideon has prepared clones, hybrids, soldiers who are neither Mandalorian nor Imperial, but something far worse. And yet, in the face of this threat, the Mandalorians are no longer divided. The children of the Watch and the mercenaries fight side by side. They share food, forge plans, and mourn the dead together. The dream of Mandalore's rebirth is no longer a fantasy, it is a cause. The title refers not only to the obvious Imperial spies, but hints at betrayal yet to come. Rumors swirl about who within the Mandalorians may have betrayed their mission. Is there a traitor among them? Or is the real spy someone still hiding in plain sight? With Din captured, Bo-Katan wounded, and Gideon fortified, the final looms large. But one truth remains clear: Mandalore is not just a planet, it is an idea. And ideas, as history shows, are hard to kill. Part 1. Once, Boba had hated the Jedi. He still didn't exactly like them, but it was hard to hate a group of people that he'd watched be systematically executed, and the very few survivors hunted down and slaughtered. So no, Boba didn't really hate the Jedi anymore. But, gods help him, Obi-Wan. Kenobi drove him insane. Disintegration, the old man said, nodding seriously. We'll make it look like it was disintegration. It won't work. As was normal, Obi-Wan ignored him. And how had Boba's brothers, but not brothers, dealt with him? Commander Cody must have been some sort of deity to have spent 3 years at Kenobi's side and not murdered him. Boba flinched at the thought and hoped that Obi-Wan hadn't gotten a hint of it in his whole Force sense, because Boba had a couple of lines he tried not to cross, and reminding Obi-Wan that his trusted commander had been forced to kill him would probably cross some of those. You'll still get the bounty reward for taking out Obi-Wan Kenobi, which, if I do say so myself, is starting to get ridiculously exorbitant, while I get to once again disappear with no one looking for me. Obi-Wan was really this ridiculous, or if he was trying to make Boba really murder him. If he was trying to make Boba really murder him. And then it looks like I don't know how to do my job. I've got a reputation, Kenobi, and you'll ruin it. Obi-Wan snorted, and and I have a reputation for making even Vader look like a fool. No one's going to be judging you too harshly when they've all been fooled just as badly. I'd like to not be one of those fools. Boba wasn't pouting. He wasn't. Boba was wearing his helmet, but the smirk on Obi-Wan's face said he knew that Boba was pouting and found it hilarious. Ah, young Fett. Everyone is one of those fools. Sometimes Boba wondered what would have happened if his boar and Kenobi had actually had the chance to know each other, instead of fighting once and then his boar being killed by Criffin Windu. He was always split on whether his buir would have murdered Kenobi for being the most annoying person he'd ever met, or if his buir would have been as reluctantly charmed by the man the way everyone else was. Boba included. He had genuinely planned to murder Kenobi the first time. The bounty for all surviving Jedi was pretty high, but Boba had mostly ignored them, the whole genocide thing having somewhat turned him off. But Kenobi's bounty was astronomical, and Boba had still had enough leftover hatred over the fact that if Kenobi had never shown up on Kamino, then his buir would never have ended up murdered on Geonosis to convince himself that going after Kenobi was fair. But then, Obi-Wan had managed to get the drop on Boba, and somehow there'd been tea and dinner involved, and the next thing Boba knew, he'd been helping Obi-Wan sneak past an Imperial blockade, and they were kind of friends. He genuinely had no idea how the man did it. Aren't you supposed to be hiding out on some desert planet? Boba complained. Why do I keep running into you while you make a mess of everything? I'll make no apologies for making a mess of the Empire's dealings, Obi-Wan said easily. And who's to say I wasn't hiding out here this whole time? Boba snorted. Because if you had been hiding out here, you wouldn't be having this conversation with me right now because I'd have never found you. Perhaps I made a mistake, Obi-Wan offered. Boba just raised an eyebrow. And Obi-Wan, who always seemed to know what look Boba was giving him, despite the fact that Boba was wearing his helmet, huffed. All right, so I haven't been hiding out on this planet, but I had reason for being here. And reason for drawing attention to myself. What was it? This time, Obi-Wan gave him a raised eyebrow. Oh, come on. Boba did not pout. I'm about to help you fake your death again. It was kind of amazing that anyone ever believed Kenobi was dead, since Boba was pretty sure, if he counted that time during the war, that Kenobi had faked his death at least 5 or 6 times now. Boba had already helped him do it twice. Although I suppose I should be grateful I get credit for it this time. Yes, you could probably retire with how many credits this will gain you, Obi-Wan said, as though him faking his death was doing Boba a favor. I should at least get to know why you decided to bring the attention of 3 different Imperial battalions and half the Bounty Hunters Guild down on you. Obi-Wan's face did that thing, where his eyes went all sad, but the rest of his face twisted into a snooty glare. It's not, please. Obi-Wan sighed. I'd heard rumor that some of my men from the 2012th were going to be here, Obi-Wan admitted. I'd hoped that perhaps I'd be able to draw some of them out to hunt me. Boba slumped a little. It wasn't really a surprise. He'd known Obi-Wan long enough now to know that Kenobi had loved Boba's brothers, but not brothers, and that their betrayal had almost killed Kenobi more than the actual cannon they'd shot at him had. Obi-Wan would probably have preferred that Boba never knew that, but Boba had been seeing the nightmare and the tears that Obi-Wan pretended weren't there when he woke up. What were you going to do, kidnap them? Obi-Wan shrugged. Boba closed his eyes and reminded himself that banging his head on a wall wouldn't help him. And then, what? Smuggle a bunch of unconscious troopers past everyone hunting you? Obi-Wan shrugged again. I don't know how the hell you're still alive, Boba decided. Were there any of the 212th around? Because it was the stupidest plan Boba had ever heard. But if Obi-Wan had already gotten this far in his plan, Boba might as well end up helping him to make sure that neither Kenobi or Boba's brothers, but not brothers, ended up dead. No. Obi-Wan's voice wasn't sad. Boba didn't think he'd ever actually heard Obi-Wan be sad. As though he thought that if he let some of the sorrow that literally emanated from him be heard, then people would realize that he wasn't Obi-Wan. Untouchable's Kenobi, but rather a man that had been betrayed and lost everything and was just doing his best to survive in a galaxy that wanted to destroy him. Sometimes, Boba thought that was what had really won Boba over into being Obi-Wan Kenobi's friend. Because sometimes he looked at Obi-Wan Kenobi, whose whole world had been destroyed and he was still maintaining that he was fine, and he saw his Burr again, who had known his own fair share of loss and had still kept all of that grief inside so that no one could ever use it against him. Fine, Boba decided. Disintegration. We'll pretend to disintegrate you, but you're going to stay out of sight for at least a year, if not 2. Obi-Wan smiled at him as though they weren't planning how to fake Kenobi's death so that he could lose the hundreds of Imperials and Hunters that were currently on his tail. Thank you, Boba. You're trouble, Kenobi, Boba said, and he tried to keep his fondness out of his voice. Oh, that is undoubtedly true, Obi-Wan said, and this time his smile seemed almost genuine. Boba had a bad feeling that Obi-Wan wouldn't even make it half a year before he made Boba's life difficult again. Part 2. Boba only learned that Obi-Wan had been killed for real this time, nearly a year after it had happened. He'd heard rumors, of course, but he'd heard rumors of Kenobi's death so many times over the years, had helped contribute to so many of them, that he hadn't actually given them much thought. He'd started getting mildly concerned, not worried, never worried, a few months in when he hadn't seen or heard from Obi-Wan. It was unusual for them to go so long without some sort of communication. But he'd been aware of the turmoil the rebellion was going through after Alderaan and the whole Death Star shtick, so he just assumed that Obi-Wan was busy. After all, Kenobi had faked his death more times than Boba could count. Surely he'd just done it again. Except this time, somehow, it was real. It had been at Vader's hand, or so he heard. Which wasn't a surprise. Everyone who paid enough attention knew that Vader was just the slightest bit obsessed with Kenobi. Boba wasn't sad, per se. He and Obi-Wan were sort of friends, but only sort of. And if that was a more solid friendship than the majority of what Boba had, then that just meant that Boba was a loner who liked it that way. But it did mean that when a ghostly blue figure showed up while Boba was definitely not in mourning for a man he'd only barely known and only kind of liked, that he'd had enough alcohol in his system to not be sure it was actually happening. "Did you fake your death again?" Boba asked. Because that seemed a reasonable question to ask, even if it didn't explain why Obi-Wan was blue. Oh no. Obi-Wan smiled at him, and Boba found it odd how he couldn't quite determine what age Obi-Wan was. He looked as old as he'd looked the last time Boba had, completely unintentionally, of course, run across him. And yet at the same time he looked young, like he had that first time Boba had met him, when Boba had been a 10-year-old whose whole life hadn't yet been thrown into chaos with the death of his boar. Boba blamed it on the alcohol. "I'm quite dead, I assure you." Boba nodded and accepted that. "So, I'm hallucinating you? 'Cause, got to say, while I don't hate you, if I were going to hallucinate a dead man, I have a list of people that I'd pick to see before you." Obi-Wan didn't seem at all offended. That's fair. But I'm afraid I'm not a hallucination. I'm quite real. Boba's stomach clenched a little bit, and he wondered if maybe he'd had a bit too much to drink. "Tell me it's Force or sick." Obi-Wan's face got so damned soft, and Boba kind of hated him. Hated him for being soft and kind. Hated him for being ridiculous and reckless. Hated him for being dead and leaving Boba. It is because of the Force, yes. If your father was capable of such, he'd have come to you long before.
And that?
That was another reason why Boba hated him. Because Boba hadn't said anything about his beer. And here Obi-Wan was knowing that some part of Boba had wondered that why, if dead people could apparently appear to him, his beer hadn't. That's not what I meant. It had been. And anyways, it's been over 2 decades. And that'll never stop you from loving him. Obi-Wan finished, and Boba wished that Obi-Wan would go back to being a reckless idiot that made plans that'd get him killed, and stop being all wise and kind and all that Osik. Right. Boba was too drunk and Obi-Wan was too dead for them to be having this conversation. "So, what are you doing here if you're actually dead and I'm not hallucinating?" Obi-Wan sighed a little bit. "I'm here to ask a favor that may or may not ruin your life." Boba blinked at him. Whoa, at least you're honest about it. He tried to figure out how Obi-Wan could possibly ruin his life more than it already was. Did your little youngling that I've never had confirmation exists get into trouble? Because I've got to say, after having bailed you out of trouble as often as I have, I think I could probably handle that. No one could be as terrible as you are. Obi-Wan rolled his eyes. You hardly bailed me out of trouble, Boba. Boba narrowed his eyes. I have a list, do you want? Anyways, Obi-Wan continued, ignoring him. I'm not here to ask you to join the rebellion. Luke and Leia are doing just fine, and I'm looking out for them both as well as I can. 2 younglings. That probably weren't so young, huh? Boba was only kind of surprised. He made a mental note to see if he could track them down, because if they were anything like Obi-Wan, then they'd probably get themselves neck-deep in trouble in no time and would absolutely need someone to bail them out, and Obi-Wan was too dead to do that himself. Not that Boba would be the one to do it. And even if he did, it would just be because he liked it when people owed him. He pushed the thought aside and back to the matter at hand. So, Obi-Wan sighed, and he sounded exhausted. Boba had always kind of assumed that dying meant you got to rest, but Obi-Wan seemed far from rested. Vader has gotten an idea in his head. And yep, Boba could already see where Obi-Wan was going with this whole may or may not ruin his life bit. That he can change the past. Boba snorted. Has anyone ever told Vader that he's delusional? Obi-Wan smiled, but it was the sad smile that Boba hated, but had never truly understood. Sure, Vader was awful, but that shouldn't make Obi-Wan this sort of sad. I don't think most people are brave enough, and to be fair, most of them would probably be dead if they tried. You can't change the past, Boba pointed out. You'd think 1 or 2 more people would think that reason enough to say something. Except Obi-Wan didn't agree. No. Instead, Obi-Wan hesitated. Wait, you can't change the past, can you? Boba asked, because he was talking to the apparition of a dead man, and before this, Boba had been pretty sure you couldn't do that either. He glanced down at the alcohol in his hand and wondered if maybe he really had had too much to drink. He did his best, generally, to not let himself get drunk because that seemed like a good way to get dead. But maybe he'd misjudged the strength of the alcohol. Normally, I'd say that you're right, and the idea that someone could change the past is ridiculous, to say the least. Boba just blinked several times. Normally, that was not the sort of qualifier that Boba wanted to hear. But in this case, there appears to be a small chance that Vader is, for once, actually right. And as you can possibly imagine, I'd rather not let Vader go back in time and make the galaxy even more of a mess than it already is. Boba shrugged, because he got where Obi-Wan was coming from, but also, can it really get worse? Obi-Wan looked terribly sad. Oh yes, I assure you, it could. Boba stared at him for a long minute. Your people were slaughtered. The galaxy is run by a corrupt empire. You're dead. How could it get worse? We could have no hope, Boba. Boba looked away, because what hope was there? Boba had almost no faith in the rebellion. Even if, by some miracle, they got rid of the Empire, it wouldn't help Boba. Boba's people were just as dead as Kenobi's. And really, he was surviving fine under the Empire. And anything the rebellion built would probably just make his life worse. And sure, he wasn't dead yet, but what did that matter when there was no one in the galaxy that cared he was alive? Obi-Wan's eyes got all soft again, and Boba wondered if being dead had made him better at reading Boba's mind, because if so, that absolutely cocked. I'm very glad you're still alive, Boba. Only because you want to use me, Boba grumbled, choosing to ignore that most of the times he'd run into Obi-Wan. Back when Obi-Wan hadn't been dead, it had always been Boba who had volunteered his help, because Obi-Wan had never asked anything of him. Even though he really should have, because really, how had the man stayed alive as long as he had with all the stupid plans he came up with? No, he had just given Boba tea and listened to him talk and somehow been the closest thing to a fan. He blocked the thoughts, glaring at the apparition and daring him to be stupid enough to say anything about what Boba had been thinking. Obi-Wan didn't, because sometimes Obi-Wan had a smattering of self-preservation, even if he maybe didn't need it anymore since he was dead. Boba sighed.